We've talked about the last couple of weeks, the signs of Jesus coming in Mark 24, Mark 13. We didn't talk about Luke 21, but it's the same thing. But we have to remember that these are the birth pangs. These signs increase in frequency and intensity before the tribulation, or 70th week of Daniel, like Al likes to call it. We need to get that in our brain, okay? He's telling everybody, here's the signs. This is not the tribulation. These are the signs. And this is going to be important as we get into Revelation in next week or the week after. So why do you think there are birth pangs?
Get you ready.
Warning, get you ready. It's a warning that something big is going to happen. Because remember, once they start, there's no stopping the big event, like a birth. Any of you who have had children, we know how that is. I remember the first time, my first child, I was so excited, and as the birth pangs, I was so excited. Of course, I wasn't so excited in a little while, but then my second child, okay, so then I don't know how you kind of forget, you know it was hard, but you kind of forget. And as soon as they started, I remember saying, okay, I remember now and I don't want to do this. But once it starts, it's going to happen. And it's the same thing. It's the reason why the Lord used that analogy, right? Once this starts, it's going to happen. And the birth pangs, the signs, are going to increase in frequency. They're going to increase in duration, hardness, I guess I would say, sort of like having a birth. And so Jesus says, therefore keep watch, for you do not know on what day your Lord will come. So just know he has given us the signs for us to know, yes, he's coming. And he says, when you see all these things, and that's key also in that in various times in history, you see this, a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and you see this, oh, it must be, but this is all these things. And of course, we know that the clock didn't start till 1948, so they didn't have that then. So Al also was talked briefly about the signing of a peace agreement by the Antichrist in Daniel chapter 9. If you remember, Daniel chapter 9 goes through all the weeks, which remember 1 week is 7 years. And so it gets a little confusing, the 62 weeks and the, this week and that week, if you read through Daniel 9. And in 9:27, it talks about the covenant that the Antichrist, or the prince who is to come, is going to make with the many. So, and Al was explaining to me this morning that the word in Hebrew actually means a covenant with those who were at war.
It's the same kind of covenant they made with the different people in the Old Testament with the neighboring countries, that they wouldn't invade each other, they would cooperate with each other, they wouldn't attack each other. That's that kind of a covenant.
And the reason why I asked it is because it says they're making a covenant. And I said, well, why do we call it a peace agreement? And he said, because of what the word actually means is why they call that. So we know, when the peace agreement comes, we know that the tribulation, the actual tribulation is going to begin to happen, right? But we also know that the Gog-Magog war, according to Ezekiel 38 and 39, must take place prior to the signing of the peace covenant. Obviously, you're not going to have a peace covenant and then have a war. So that has to take place. And Al, probably because I tell him, quit putting so much scripture in there, you know how he likes to do, has not read this portion, and I'm going to read this because he's going to talk a little bit more about this as we get going. This is in Ezekiel 38 and part of 39. If you want to follow along, you can. If you just want to listen, that's okay. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Prophesy against him and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against you, O Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaws, and bring you out with your whole army, your horses, your horsemen, fully armed, and a great horde with large and small shields, all of them brandishing their swords. Persia, Cush, and Put will be with them, all with shields and helmets, also Gomer with all its troops, and Beth Togarmah from the far north with all its troops, the many nations with you. Get ready, be prepared, you and all the hordes gathered about you, and take command of them. After many days you'll be called to arms. In future years you will invade a land that has recovered from war, whose people were gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate. I think in some versions it said in the last days, but anyway. Where I am. Okay. They had been brought out from the nations, and now all of them live in safety. You and all your troops and the many nations with you will go up, advancing like a storm. You will be like a cloud covering the land. This is what the sovereign Lord says. On that day, thoughts will come into your mind, and you will devise an evil scheme. You will say, I will invade a land of unwalled villages. I will attack a peaceful and unsuspecting people, all of them living without walls and without gates and bars. I will plunder and loot and turn my hand against the resettled ruins and the people gathered from the nations, rich in livestock and goods, living at the center of the land. Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish and all her villages will say to you, have you come to plunder? Have you gathered your hordes to loot or carry off silver and gold, to take away livestock and goods and to seize much plunder? Therefore, son of man, prophesy and say to Gog, this is what the sovereign Lord says. In that day, when my people Israel are living in safety, will you take notice of it? You will come from your place in the far north, you and many nations with you, all of them riding on horses, a great horde, a mighty army. You will advance against my people Israel like a cloud that covers the land. In days to come, O Gog, I will bring you against my land so that the nations may know me when I show myself holy through you before their eyes. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Are you not the one I spoke of in former days by my servants, the prophets of Israel? At that time they prophesied for years that I would bring you against them. This is what will happen in that day. When Gog attacks the land of Israel, my hot anger will be aroused, declares the sovereign Lord. In my zeal and fiery wrath, I declare that at that time there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. The fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the beasts of the field, every creature that moves along the ground, and all the people on the face of the earth will tremble at my presence. The mountains will be overturned, the cliffs will crumble, and every wall will fall to the ground. I will summon a sword against Gog on all my mountains, declares the sovereign Lord. Every man's sword will be against his brother. I will execute judgment upon him with plague and bloodshed. I will pour down torrents of rain, hailstones, and burning sulfur on him and on his troops, and on the many nations with him. And so I will show my greatness and my holiness, and I will make myself known in the sight of many nations. Then they will know that I am the Lord. Son of man, prophesy against Gog and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against you, O Gog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. I will turn you around and drag you along. I will bring you from the far north and send you against the mountains of Israel. Then I will strike your bow from your left hand and make your arrows drop from your right hand. On the mountains of Israel you will fall, and all your troops and the nations with you. I will give you as food to all kinds of carrion birds and to the wild animals. You will fall in the open field, for I have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. I will send fire on Magog and on those who live in safety in the coastlands, and they will know that I am the Lord. I will make known my holy name among my people Israel. I will no longer let my holy name be profaned, and the nations will know that I, the Lord, am the Holy One in Israel. It is coming. It will surely take place, declares the sovereign Lord. This is the day I have spoken of. Then those who live in the towns of Israel will go out and use the weapons for fuel and burn them up, the small and large shields, the bows and arrows, the war clubs and spears. For 7 years they will use them for fuel. Remember those words, for 7 years. That's not just arbitrary time. They will not need to gather wood from the fields or cut it from the forest, because they will use the weapons for fuel, and they will plunder those who plundered them and loot those who looted them, declares the sovereign Lord. On that day I will give Gog a burial place in Israel, in the valley of those who travel east toward the sea. It will block the way of travelers, because Gog and all his hordes will be buried there. So it will be called the Valley of Hamon-Gog. For 7 months The house of Israel will be burying them in order to cleanse the land. All the people of the land will bury them, and the day I am glorified will be a memorial day for them, declares the sovereign Lord. Men will be regularly employed to cleanse the land. Some will go throughout the land, and in addition to them, others will bury those that remain on the ground. At the end of the 7 months, they will begin their search. As they go through the land and one of them sees a human bone, he will set up a marker beside it until the grave diggers have buried it in the valley of Hamon-Gog. Also a town called Hamanah will be there, and so they will cleanse the land. And then verse 28, then they will know that I am the Lord their God, for though I sent them into exile among the nations, I will gather them to their own land, not leaving any behind. I will no longer hide my face from them, for I will pour out my spirit on the house of Israel, declares the sovereign Lord. So after this war, Israel is going to know its God. And this is the beginning of the tribulation, okay? Because it says 7 years after this war. So as you remember, Al has said in the past, and he'll talk about it again, but we are in the time of the Gentiles, as Jesus said. When that is fulfilled, then it's going to go into the tribulation, which, as he says, the veil was on Israel during the time of the Gentiles, not that some aren't saved, but as we go into the time of tribulation, the veil is put on the Gentiles, and Israel now sees. So, and you think to yourself, really? They're going to know who God is as this starts? Al will talk about all of this as we get going into the seals, okay? So, do we see this war potentially taking place soon? Because when we see this war come, we know that we're right at the door. Now, we may go just before, we may go during, we may go just after, we may go, maybe we'll see the Antichrist and he'll start to sign a peace covenant. I don't know, but somewhere in there, and we can show that through Revelation as we get there. But on the news, almost every night, we see something escalating in the Middle East, either with Russia, Iran, Syria, Turkey, or the Ukraine. And of course, Amir talks about it all the time also. And one of the latest ones we talked briefly about last time is the peace agreement that China brokered between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And that peace agreement is that they will not allow Israel to fly over their land to hit Iran. So this is going to be very, very interesting. All part of this end time stuff, which is. And we also see how the USA is not likely to support Israel if there is an attack on Israel with our current administration, which seems to be implied in one of the verses I read. Basically, it talks about some very specific merchant countries that are going to say, what are you doing? What are you doing? But it also talks about the young lions, newer countries, right? Because countries that did not exist then, which United States didn't exist at that point in time. Anyway, the whole world is going to say, you shouldn't do that, sort of like Ukraine. You shouldn't do that, right? Now, with Ukraine, a lot of people have given Ukraine a bunch of weapons, etc. We're not going to have any money to be able to give them anything. Not only that, the current administration is not ready and willing to help Israel in such a way. So
that brings us back to pretty much where we left off last week. And so just to bring it, you're going to see this a lot, just so you keep getting it in your minds. This is the chart, Daniel's 70th week. We were talking about that a second ago, where it talks about 7 weeks, which is 49 years, and then another section of 62 weeks, which is another additional 434, and then the Messiah will be crucified. If the timeline had continued on, 7 years after his crucifixion, he would have come back to set up his millennial kingdom. But it didn't. So we know there's a pause, a gap. Jesus addresses that in Luke 21, and he says, you're going to be scattered through all the nations until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. So the time of the Gentiles is during this gap, as you see on the screen. And then begins the birth pangs. At the close of the time of the Gentiles, we see the birth pangs starting. And as Bobby just reviewed, is that those birth pangs, those signs that Jesus gave us, are the preliminary events leading up to the beginning of the tribulation and the rapture of the church. And then as we focus a little bit more on that very end portion of that, we see the signs and the seals, and we're going to get to why I include the seals there in the upcoming weeks. And we see that that's all premature or prior to the rapture and the signing of the peace of covenant in Daniel 9, and also the Gog-Magog war that we were just talking about. So we'll see these charts over and over again as we continue through our study. When we go back to the Gog-Magog war for a minute, when in the time of the restoration, Israel's being pulled back, they were scattered through all the nations. It says in the prior chapters of Ezekiel, in 30, starting with about 34 on before the Gog-Magog war in 38, he talks about the gathering of all the Israelites back to the country, blessing the land. You can attest the land is very fruitful, very green, very much in full blossom, and everything is the way that Ezekiel said it would be. Thousands of years prior to this happening, and it's happening today. And as Bobby mentioned a few minutes ago, that it begins or appearing of the starting of that clock, not the 7-year clock, but the starting of that. When you see these things happening, clock, when you see all the things prior to Israel being gathered back to the land, you can't look at that. That doesn't count. But now, since Israel's back in the land, we know that now the events, as we see them all happening together, are screaming to the end, to the birth pangs, to the birth of that, or the end, what we call the tribulation time. So when in this time does this war take place? Well, as you remember, some of the words that she said say that, what? It says that when they're settled in the land, it says that, let me back up a screen here. Let me read this to you. It says that they're going to come upon them when? It says when they're living in the land, they've been revived to return to the land, and they're being fruitful. And it says, and those people have acquired cattle and goods, and they're living securely, or in their mind, they're settled. Securely meaning settled. They're settled in the land. And that's what we see today. So we know that this war couldn't have taken place over the last 2,000 plus years. Why is that important? A lot of people think that this war was the war that took place, or it actually wasn't a war, but when the Romans invaded Jerusalem or Israel in 70 AD and destroyed the temple, that is not this war. Everything that we just read does not fit historically what happened in 70 AD. So we know that this war, and it didn't happen prior to that time, and so we know this war hasn't taken place yet. So where does this take place? Again, it has to be after Israel is back securely settled in their land, being fruitful, being blessed by God in that sense, and he's replenishing them on the land. Well, some people ask, is this the same war as the Battle of Armageddon? When does the Battle of Armageddon take place? At the end of the 7 years, right? So a lot of people look at this passage and say, well, that's the same battle as the Battle of Armageddon. It's just, they're just, redefining the nations a little bit more for this. But I contest that that's not the case. And so why do I say that? Well, we need to look at who the players are in this war. Okay? So let's briefly look back again. In chapter 38, verse 2, he says, Son of man, set your face toward Gog, the land of Magog, and the prince of Rosh, Meshech, Tubal, and prophesy against them. So right off the bat, we see Gog and Rosh. And of course, Rosh is usually used in the term of the head or the upper part or the controlling of this. Gog being that person, Rosh being who Gog is. Gog is going to be referenced as the leader or the brains or the organizer or the one who's instigating this war. Okay?
And that's why Ezekiel says, I set my face against you, Gog. And of course, my mind's thinking Putin. I mean, I know that Putin could be taken out any day. Someone could assassinate him, could be someone else. But I'm thinking that the Lord's saying, I am against you, Putin. And I'm going to let your mind do what it's going to do, and it's going to decide to come against this. And I'm going to actually put a hook in your jaw, and I'm going to bring you here, because then I'm going to destroy you. And
he says he's coming from the far, far north. If you take Israel on a map, and I'm going to show you that in a second, and go straight up north, what country is it far north? Russia. Okay? And what's Russia proposing, and what are they doing right now? What's Russia doing in the world scene today? These are some things that we have been looking at. So, and then he goes on to mention Magog, Meshach, and Tubal. These are main players, and I'm going to show you in a map here in a second where those are referenced in today's geography, so you can get an idea of what the players are here. And then he goes on in verse 5 and he mentions that he includes Persia. Well, Iran was called Persia up until 1920s. And so it's not been that long ago that was who they were called. So it's very obviously that Persia is being referred here to as Iran. Ethiopia and Put is being down in the Sudan area. And then Gomer, Beth Togarmah, and many other peoples with you, it says in verse 6. So where are these areas? Okay, so here's Turkey, Gomer at the top, Togarmah off to the east side, Meshach kind of there, Tubal, you see that, Gog, Magog, Iraq, you see there. These are some of the areas that they're talking about. These are the main principal players that are going to be involved in this war. Also, as in this map, you can see a little bit, we come back a little bit more of a higher view of it. You see where Put is called Libya. Ethiopia is down in the Kush area. They're going to attack from the south, Iran. You got Russia and Gog, Magog, Turkey, and all that area, all those people coming down, all coming together. This is the war we're talking about. This is the event that we're talking about, okay? So one of the things that is interesting is that Iran is also getting very involved in the threat of, and this is anything new, but Iran threatens to annihilate Israel as Hezbollah posts of reach of rockets. This is just March 14th. This is not that old. And so we were just talking back this morning about the rocket that they can hit. I'm going to back up here. The rocket that Iran has now, or at least they're boasting they have, can hit Israel. And it's a very interesting numerical number they're saying. They're saying 400 seconds, or let's put it in minutes. It's 6 minutes, 0.66. 6 minutes. 6 minutes and 6.66.
That's
interesting.
400,
That's 400 seconds that they can hit Tel Aviv from Iran. Okay. Also, here, this is a clip from just a couple, I don't have the date on here, but just a couple days ago. The coming Gog-Magog war is now at Israel's door. These are different
Israeli,
news agencies that are predicting this. This is nationwide. I mean international, not just in our nation. So this war that we're talking about is very, very much on the precipice right now of us seeing this all happening. Now, all of these groups that I just mentioned, all of these countries are what? They're Islamic countries. And we see that through those verses, that those nations that I just read in Ezekiel 38, verses 2, 3, 5, and 6. What is Islam? What is one of their things that they say in their creed, in their belief system, is that Israel does not have the right to exist, and they want to annihilate Israel, as well as they call Israel the little Satan, and they call United States the big Satan, and their whole mantra is to destroy these two nations in particular. So they're all going to come together against Israel at the same time with the idea to annihilate her. We saw that in verse 15, where of Ezekiel 38, he says, "You will come from out of your place in the remote parts of the north." Remember, we're talking about the remote part of the north. "You and many peoples with you, all of them riding horses in great assembly, and a mighty army." So the verbiage in Ezekiel 38 is suggesting an all-out ground war. Okay, now that's different than what the threats are being right now. Most of the threats are being missiles, and I mean they're constantly being barraged by rockets and stuff like that. And of course they have the Iron Dome, which takes out 99% of all those things. But this war that they're talking about is going to take place on the ground. And why is that, besides the fact that he says you're going to come with horses and all that, which is probably the best thing Ezekiel could come up with at the time to illustrate that this is a ground invasion, because they may not come on horses in this war. They might come in tanks and in armored vehicles and all that kind of thing. But this is the way that they're going to come, because when God destroys them, as Bobby read a little bit ago, they're going to be destroyed, and they're going to go out and have to bury all the dead people. And it's going to take them 7 months to bury the enemy. That's a long time to bury a bunch of people. And that's just, again, you're not going to bury a bunch of people if they're just shooting missiles at you from their home country. Okay? So this whole war is ordained and orchestrated by God. We see that God says in verse 4 that he's going to put the hook in the mouth. And he's going to draw them into there. And in verse 8 he says, after many days you will be summoned in the latter years to this land that's been restored from the sword, and whose inhabitants have gathered from many nations to the mountains of Israel. They used to be a continual waste, but now the people are being fruitful and living securely, or being settled there. The people have resettled there. Okay? So this God is the what's behind this war, and it's for a reason, and we're going to see that as we continue through this a little bit here. So this is going to happen in the latter years of history, or the time given to the Gentiles, because the Gentiles are still calling the shots. They're the ones that is still in focus. Who's the focal point in this war? It's Gog and Magog. And what's going to happen to them as a result, as Bobby read in the passage here, that God's going to step up to the plate here, and he's going to take them out. So God defeats them. We see that in 18 through 23. And also we saw that in the following chapter in 39, verses 3 through 6. And there's no indication that any nation is going to step up to the plate and help. It's not that, hey, I'm so glad the United States stepped up with their military and helped us beat these guys back and we won the war. There's no mention of that. It's all about who. Who gets the credit? Who gets the glory? Who is it that's being made known? God. God is being made known. And that's why no other nation is going to step in and help them. That's why the United States is going to be sitting by idly. And that's why you see in verse 8 where he says, I'm sorry, not verse 8, but in 13, he says, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish and all of its villages will say to you, hey guys, what are you doing? You shouldn't do that. That's not a good thing to do. Sort of like what the attitude is to Ukraine a lot. Hey, Russia, you shouldn't be doing. What do you think you guys are doing? Now we're helping feed them with armaments, but we're basically, as a world, we're all sitting back going, hey, Russia, you really shouldn't be doing that. That's not nice. You're not being playing very fair. But they don't do anything. And this is the case when this whole horde comes against Israel. That's going to be the attitude of the nations is, but hands off, and just a point, wag the finger at them, and that's about it. Because God is the one who's going to get the glory. God is the one that's going to be promoted. He's going to be the one that's going to come into full view. And as it says in verse 23 of chapter 38, I will magnify myself, I'll sanctify myself, I'll make myself known in the sight of many nations, and they will know that I am the Lord. And he reiterates that down here in the next chapter as well. So God's going to defeat them, and now God's name is made known throughout the world. And what does it say about this? That people will do what? He says when he starts to talk about his wrath, he says that all the earth is going to quake, or what is it? What's the word? I just lost it here. And there will be a great earthquake in all the land. And let's see. Yeah, it says all the people on the earth will shake at my presence. Well, we're going to see that again, and we get into Revelation. So just keep hold of that thought, that all the people at this point in time cry out, in essence, of hide us from God's wrath. Because God's wrath is going to be poured out. He says, when this war happens, my fury is going to mount up. My wrath is going to be made known. It hasn't been made known up to this point. But at this point in time, my wrath is going to become evident, and you're going to know who I am. And he's going to destroy these people. It says that they're going to be burying this enemy for 7 months in the area called Hamon-Gog, which, to the best of scholars, it says to the east of the sea. It's usually in reference to the Dead Sea, and so that's a proximate area, and it happens to be a big valley or flat area. It says in the fields, as we read in 39, and so that's a suggested place. It says, as we read the verse in 39:11, it says, shall come to pass in that day that I will give unto Gog a place there for burial in Israel, the valley. So we know it's a valley of the passers-by. That was a phrase they called it, because it was a route that they used to take to skirt around all of that, around Israel and around that area there. and there shall be, they bury Gog and all the multitude, and they shall call it the valley of Hamon Gog. So that's the area that is mostly referenced in as Bible scholars are looking at. That's probably the most likely place, because they're coming against Jerusalem, and it's a very easy place for them to mount. They're kind of protected from the sea, and then they scoot around the north end, right up past Jericho and right up into Jerusalem.
And that area right now is called Jordan.
And that is Jordan right now.
So I have no idea why they're buried there, except that we do not contaminate Israel
well, they have to go out.
with the dead.
Right, but they have to go out and cleanse the land
Right. according
according to this, and it takes them 7 months. Okay, so the spoils and all of the stuff that Israel's going to claim from this wipe of God wiping these guys out. So they're not bombing and destroying all of the tanks and all of the things they're coming with. They're going to be preserved. God's going to just destroy the people. He's going to kill all the people, and then they're going to have access to all this armament, all this equipment, all the fuel depot, all the stuff that they've gathered together to mount this war up, and it's going to last for a 7-year period of time. And Bobby mentioned to the 7-year period of time, but we're going to come back to that in just a second. So it's going to take 7 months to bury the enemy, not to bury Israel, and not to bury their own people, the enemies. Now, think about it. If you are still under the threat of missile attack, ambushes, firing upon you, you're not going to spend 7 months over there burying the enemy if you constantly are looking around over your shoulder waiting to see if you're going to get shot or not. So obviously during the 7 months, it's a time of what? Relative peace, right? So there's going to be a time, and this correlates everything as we look at Scripture here. At the end of the Gog-Magog war, we see a time of peace, a time of Israel entering a time of peace, and also entering a time of 7 years. What other thing do we have to think back on? Well, we reflect back to Daniel chapter 9, and we look at that 7-year period of time, and who is it that steps up to the plate? The prince who's to come, or what we call the Antichrist. And he's going to set a time of peace with the many, with all the Middle East. He's gonna like waltz in and like, hey guys, let's all have peace. After they saw what God just did, they don't want to mess with anybody on Israel. And they're going to be able to bury all these people. And they start this 7-year period of time in this. Now, is 7 years just an arbitrary number that Ezekiel puts down? Or is that a specific number? Do you think Daniel was just pulling numbers out of his head when he gave us the timeline in Daniel 9? I don't think so. God's specific, and when they start a 7-year period of time, that's important to take note of. Okay, so this period of time will be one of relative peace for Israel, and I think at least for the first 3.5 years it will be, until the Antichrist then breaks that covenant and marches down into Jerusalem and commits what we call the abomination of desolation. So, and again, I was kind of preempting myself here, but it says that this will probably be due to the prince who's to come in chapter 9, establishing that peace agreement for the 7 years. And that starts the 7 years of tribulation. So in light of now of what all these things we've been talking about, where does this war fall? Where does this war take place at in relation to the 7 years? Just before the 7 years kicks off. Well, where are we on the timeline? If we're looking at the birth pangs happening just before the 7 years, where are we at with this? Could this happen anytime? Are we right there? I think so. I think this is exciting to watch what's going on here, because it just means that the rapture is all that more imminent for us. Okay? What's going on here? So after the defeat of Gog and Magog, God begins to restore Israel back. If we continue through this passage here, after what Bobby kind of stopped and skipped over a little bit, but verses 25 through 29 show that God now is going to bring back that state of worship. We're going to see what else happening here. Their temple will be rebuilt. They're going to establish sacrifices. They're going to go back to the way that they should have been doing all along here. It says in the next chapters of Ezekiel, which is just coming through the passage here chapter 40 through 44, they talk about reestablishing the temple and rebuilding it and what it'll look like and how big it will be and all of the sacrifices that will be reinstituted during this time. So you see how it just all fits into the timeline, because we know at the midway point of the 7 years, the Antichrist comes into the temple and he abolishes all that. He puts an end to the sacrifices. He puts an end to the worship in the temple. He puts an end to all that. So they're going to see a 3.5 year period of time when they now recognize who God is. And as I mentioned in the book of Romans, chapter 11, where the veil is over the Israelites now, at that point in time, and as the illustration of the olive tree, the branches, we were grafted in. Before we were grafted in, the branches were taken out and set off to the side. That was Israel. And that's the veil they just don't understand. And God has it that way. So at the end here, he took us, grafted us in the tree. He's going to take us out of the tree and take us home on the rapture. And he's going to sit them back in the tree. And all of a sudden that veil is going to come off of them. And they're, without understand, And then the veil, as it were, we're going to be put on the rest of the Gentiles, because it says in Thessalonians that there's going to be this great deception that's going to be put upon them, so they would not believe the truth. They can't comprehend the truth. They can't understand the truth. And we see that as we get into the 7 years of tribulation. We see that in Revelation, where at the end of the trumpet judgments, all the people repented and came back to the Lord? No. They still stayed in their sin. They shook their fists in God's face, and they were really upset with God for all the trial, all the stuff that's befallen on them. So this time in Ezekiel, right after the war, is a restoration of their worship, of God being the center, and them recognizing who God is. It'll also be the time when we see the 144,000 at work. We see that in Revelation chapter 7 and verses 3 through 8, where God's going to anoint or take 144,000, 12,000 from every tribe of Israel. They're Jews. They're going to be stamped. They're going to be marked. And they're going to be commissioned to go out and spread the gospel throughout. And so it's going to be that time of coming back to the God. Israel's going to come back to God. They're going to see who God is. And then the two witnesses will also be there, and they're going to stand where? They're going to be standing in front of the temple. And their time is, the time they're given, according to chapter 11 of Revelation, is 3.5 years. Does that correlate to any other 3.5 year mark? Yeah. That they're going to be prophesying, they're going to be standing in front of the temple for 3.5 years. And we're all going to be able to see them. We won't be there, we'll be up there. But people, the world will be able to see them. Why? Because we got live cams on it right now. Right today, we can pull up a camera and look at the Wailing Wall, or Western Wall, they call it now. There's also one on the Mount Olives, and there's another one on the other side of the Temple Mount. There's cameras all over that are feeding live images right now. I could go on the internet right now and pull them up, and we could all sit here and watch whatever's going on at that time of the day in Israel.
We should have done it when Karen was there. She could have told us
what
day.
Yeah, tell us what day you could have waved to us, right? That would have worked. There'll also be a time when the trumpet judgments begin. So this time that we're looking forward to, the war, it immediately, I think, right after that is concluded with the Antichrist stepping up to the plate, initiating the peace agreement, and the temple being reinstituted, and then the time of the trumpet judgments will start. And we'll see trumpet judgments lasting, we'll go over this more and more, 3.5 years, and the bowl judgments lasting 3.5 years. Okay? So, going back to my question before, I mentioned, is this the same war as the Battle of Armageddon? Is the Gog-Magog war the same as the Battle of Armageddon? Well, first of all, we've just seen who the players are, right? The players are all of these Islamic nations that surround Israel, all the way from Russia all the way down into Africa. Those are the nations, not the whole world. The whole world's not against them, just them, right? So the participants of these wars are not the same. They're not the same. In Ezekiel, they're all these Islamic nations, right? In Revelation 16:14, the Battle of Armageddon, it's all the kings of the world are coming together. So there's two different sets of players here. We're not even talking about the same group of people that are going to be involved in this war. The outcome is not the same. Why? Well, in Ezekiel 39, Israel goes out at the end of that war, and they bury the enemy dead for 7 months, right? And they begin a 7-year of time period when God reestablishes himself. as their king, as their God, and they're going to recognize who he is. He's going to be glorified, magnified, sanctified, all those words that we just read here. In Revelation 16:19, when Jesus comes back to defeat that battle of Armageddon, he also comes in Israel's split apart in three parts, it says in Revelation 16:19. And Jesus returns and he comes and he puts his feet and lands on the Mount of Olives. And all sorts of stuff change. And then he sets up his rule for 1,000 years. Two different outcomes. Two different wars. Okay? The Gog-Magog war, Russia's most likely the leader who's going to bring this all and bring all these countries together as a concentrated war. In Antichrist will then bring peace after that war. That's what it looks like. That at the end of that war, in order for them to enter a time of peace, because up till that time, they're under the constant threat of being attacked and being annihilated, as it were, the way that the Islamic people will claim it. So at the end of that war, the Antichrist comes in. He's established a peace covenant with the many for 7 years. But on the Battle of Armageddon, the Antichrist leads the war. Well, on the other war, you see the difference? And the other one, he's bringing peace to the area. On this one, he's the initiator of it. Christ brings the peace after the war in the Battle of Armageddon. So you see, there's not really, a lot of people get confused. A lot of people say they're the same, one and the same, but it's very clear in my mind anyway, that these are very distinctly two different wars. And there's lots of other differences. We'll get to those in another time. So as we kind of come to the end of this time, the king's coming. He's coming again. So let's be like the wise men and recognize these signs that we're looking at. These signs that he's coming. His arrival is around the corner. So with the signs of Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21 coming all to fulfillment in our eyes. We've already gone through those. We saw all the different things, the deception of the world, the false Christ, the wars and rumors of wars, the pestilence, the plagues, the famines, the earthquakes. All of these things are mounting. The hatred against Christians and Jews, the animosity between husband and wife and families. You see people being shot up all the time in their own families, random school shootings, and they're increasing, and the statistics are very alarming way. Right, all of these things are all coming together. Israel's in the land. We're right on the brink of a Gog-Magog war. All of these things are coming together. How close are we to the start of the 7 years? And as we look, and we're going to look at this maybe next week as well, that the rapture of the church takes place, and we are destined to go through God's wrath. Now, when does God's wrath start? Well, according to Ezekiel, God's wrath is going to mount up. When? At the time of that war, right? So if that's when God's wrath kicks in, and we aren't destined for God's wrath, what would that indicate for us as the rapture? Maybe we're just before that. And if we start seeing that war take place, guess what? I'm just saying, it looks pretty obvious to me what kind of time frame we're looking at. So next week we're going to continue looking at some of these events that are occurring at the start of the tribulation. I'm going to probably hit just Thessalonians again, just chapter 4 or 5, and maybe 2 Thessalonians, just a couple of verses there, just to set the tone. And then we're going to jump into, it's time we got to get into Revelation and show how the seals of Revelation 6 tie into this part that we're talking about. And it will again reemphasize how close we are to that time. And then you're going to also see how these events start, instead of them just being events out here, all of a sudden they start to mesh.
Convergence.
And they converge all together on the same time. And you'll see phraseology that it mimics what we've just been talking about throughout these things. So that's what we got coming up, and it's exciting times we live in. It's not anything to be get upset or be worried about, because God's going to take us out, and it just means He's coming, and He's coming soon for us, and we just need to be on the lookout for it. Be watching.
And we have to remember that when the Antichrist comes and makes that peace treaty, he is going to be the one world leader. So there's so many things going on behind the scenes that we're going to bring out about how one world government has been in play for a long time, and how they feel they're right at the doors of making the world one, not only a government, one world religion, etc. How it's all happening behind the scenes. And for those of you who have not been studying this, you're going to be blown away. The stuff, and it used to be, when we taught it a number of years ago, it was kind of hidden. We'd find some stuff and then it would be taken off the internet and all that kind of stuff. Now anyone can find it. They're not hiding it anymore. So
The WEF is not trying to pull any punches. They're just putting it all out there, and they're in combination with the WHO, the WHO, World Health Organization, and some of the incentives or the directives that they are getting put in place. It's so close to bringing the whole world under one control, and they're going to probably use another pandemic as their whipping block, or as their leverage against the world to make them all coalesce. You see what happened in COVID-19. Everybody, they shut down businesses, they told the churches to shut down and all that, and they controlled all that. Well, we might not be so naive the next time around, but they're going to have another way.
it's going to, according to them, it's got to be some calamity.
According to the WEF.
Yeah, WEF, if you read through it, how will we control the people is what it says.
And they're already putting out articles on how they're going to do it.
Yeah,
It'll
so
blow you away.
it could be a calamity like collapse of financial system,
Yeah.
which we've got banks.
Yeah, and this
Having
last week
issues
we
right
had
now.
several banks going down. So it's all playing into it. And when you see those events, as well as what Scripture tells us is going to happen, and you start pushing them all together, we're just screaming up to the time of the rapture, and that's exciting for
Yeah.
me.
Woohoo, we're going soon.
So now let's pray and then we'll close. Thank you, Father, for this time we've spent looking in your word and getting excited about your soon return. As we see the events that you prophesied through Ezekiel